The darkness wasn't just an absence of light. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that had pressed down on me for 1,825 days. 5 years. In that void, time didn't exist. Only the faint, rhythmic thrum of a machine that kept my heart beating when my soul had seemingly checked out. But then, she appeared. Grace. My first wife, the woman I'd buried 15 years ago, stood at the edge of the abyss. She didn't look like she did at the end, ravaged by the illness that took her. She looked radiant, bathed in a silver light that pierced through the Chicago fog of my subconscious. She leaned close, her voice a chilling breeze against my ear. "Arthur," she whispered, the urgency in her tone vibrating through my very bones. "When you wake up, and you will wake up, do not trust the Navy Oxford. Do not wear the shirt Silas brings you. If you put it on, you'll never see our daughter again. Do you hear me, Arthur? Burn the blue shirt." I jolted awake with a gasp that tore through my lungs like jagged glass. The sound of my own breath was alien to me. It was too loud, too ragged. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment the world was a blur of sterile white and the piercing scent of antiseptic. My heart monitor began to wail, a frantic, rhythmic scream that mirrored the panic rising in my chest. "He's awake. God in heaven, Mr. Sterling is awake." The voice belonged to a nurse, her face a mask of professional shock. Then came Dr. Harrison, a man whose name was synonymous with elite neurological care at Northwestern Memorial. He moved with the practiced grace of old money, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his eyes wide with disbelief as he checked my vitals. "Arthur Sterling," Harrison breathed, his hand trembling slightly as he shone a light into my pupils. "You've been gone a long time, old friend. 5 years. We'd almost given up hope." I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it had been lined with sandpaper. I reached out, my hand looking like a skeletal claw, the skin pale and translucent. Where was the man who had once commanded the boardrooms of Sterling Iron, Steel? Where was the man who had built a skyscraper on the Magnificent Mile, with nothing but a hammer and a dream? "Elena," I finally croaked, the name of my second wife a prayer on my lips. "Where is Elena?" The room went deathly quiet. Dr. Harrison exchanged a look with the nurse, a look of pity that made my stomach turn. She's been notified, Arthur. She'll be here. But things have changed. You need to rest. Your body has been a passenger for 5 years." Rest was the last thing I wanted. I spent the next 48 hours in a haze of physical therapy and agonizing realization. I had to learn how to swallow, how to move my fingers, how to exist in a world that had moved on without me. But the most agonizing part was the silence. Elena didn't come that first day, nor the second. It was Silas Vane who arrived first. The door to my private suite swung open, and in walked the man who had married my daughter, Clara. Silas was a predator in a bespoke suit. He had that sharp, new money hunger in his eyes, the kind of look a wolf gives a wounded stag. He moved across the room with a confidence that felt like an insult, a stark contrast to the gritty, hardened street kid Clara had introduced me to 6 years ago. "Arthur," Silas said, his voice a smooth, calculated baritone. He didn't hug me. He didn't even touch me. He stood at the foot of the bed, his hands tucked into the pockets of a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my first truck. The miracle man himself. "The doctors said you'd be a vegetable forever. I guess you always were too stubborn to die." "Silas," I rasped, "where's Clara? Where's Elena?" "Clara's busy with the transition, and Elena." He trailed off, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, Elena has been keeping busy. She's taking care of the legacy." He reached down and placed a beautifully wrapped box on the edge of my bed. It was from a boutique on Oak Street, the kind of place where you need an appointment just to walk through the door. "A welcome home gift," Silas said, his eyes locking onto mine. "I know how much you love your fine fabrics. It's a Navy Oxford, Egyptian cotton. I want you to wear it for the press conference next week. We're announcing the merger of Sterling Iron into Vane Acquisitions. It's going to be the biggest deal in Chicago history." My heart skipped a beat. The blue shirt. Grace's warning echoed in my skull, louder than the hospital machines. "Burn the blue shirt." I'll look at it later," I said, my voice shaking. "Do more than look at it, Arthur. Wear it. It's a symbol of the new era. You wouldn't want to disappoint the shareholders, would you? Or the family?" The way he said family felt like a threat. The moment Silas left, I did something the doctors said I wouldn't be able to do for weeks. I forced myself out of that bed. Every muscle screamed in protest. My legs felt like jelly, and the floor was ice cold against my bare feet. I crawled to the window, pulling myself up by the sill. The Chicago skyline was different. There was a new tower rising near the river, and emblazoned across the top in cold, neon letters was the name, Vane. I couldn't wait for Elena to come to me. My instincts, honed over decades of high-stakes construction, were screaming that my world had been hollowed out while I slept. I managed to bribe a young orderly with a watch I'd kept in my bedside drawer, a vintage Patek Philippe that had survived the accident. "Just get me a cab," I whispered. "And don't tell the doctors I'm gone." 20 minutes later, I was standing in front of the building I'd built with my own sweat, the headquarters of Sterling Iron, Steel. But the sign was gone. In its place was a cold black plaque, Vane Maintenance, Logistics. I pushed through the revolving doors, my hospital gown hidden under a discarded janitor's jacket I'd swiped from the basement. The lobby was different. The grand oil painting of my father was gone, replaced by a digital screen scrolling stock prices. Then, I heard a voice that made my soul shatter. "You missed a spot, Elena. Scrub it again, or you're not getting your stipend this month." I rounded the corner toward the executive elevators, and my knees hit the floor. There was Elena, my beautiful, elegant wife, the woman who had been the belle of every charity gala in the city. She was on her hands and knees, wearing a faded, stained gray jumpsuit. She was scrubbing the marble floor with a coarse brush, her hands red and raw from the harsh chemicals. A young man I didn't recognize, a mid-level manager with a Vane badge, stood over her, his foot resting inches from her hand. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood," Elena whispered, her voice a ghost of its former self. "The wax was old. I'll do it again. Please, just don't tell Silas. I need the money for the hospital bills." "Then move faster, janitor," Blackwood sneered. "Vane Acquisitions doesn't pay for laziness. Silas says if the lobby isn't gleaming by noon, you can find a different way to pay for your husband's life support." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the building down with my bare hands. But as I watched my wife, the woman who had stayed by my side for 5 years while I was a ghost, humiliate herself to keep me alive, I realized the depth of the betrayal. Silas hadn't just taken my company. He had turned my family into his slaves. I started to move toward her, to pull her off that floor, when a heavy hand landed on my shoulder. I spun around, expecting a security guard, but I found myself looking into the eyes of Silas Vane himself. He was standing there with a group of investors, a shark-like grin on his face. "Arthur," he boomed, his voice carrying through the lobby, "I see you couldn't wait to see the new Sterling Iron. Moving a little fast for a dead man, aren't we?" Elena looked up, the scrub brush falling from her hand. Her eyes met mine, and for a second, the world stopped. There was no joy in her expression, only pure, unadulterated terror. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the manager, and rushed toward me, but she didn't hug me. She grabbed my arms with a grip that left bruises, her eyes darting frantically toward Silas. "Arthur, you have to leave," she hissed, her voice trembling. "Whatever you remember, whatever you think you know, you have to forget it, please. If you love us, you'll go back to that hospital and pretend you're still in that coma." "Elena, what has he done to you?" I demanded, my voice returning with a roar of old-school Chicago fury. She leaned in closer, her breath smelling of cheap coffee and despair. "It's not just the company, Arthur. Silas. He didn't just wait for you to die. He made sure the accident happened. And now, he's doing the same to Clara. He's been treating her for depression ever since the baby died." My heart stopped. What baby? Clara was pregnant. Silas stepped between us, his presence a cold wall of shadow. He draped an arm around my shoulder, leaning in so only I could hear him. "She's a bit high-strung, Arthur. The stress of your miracle recovery is a lot to handle. Why don't we go upstairs to your old office? I have that blue shirt waiting for you. We need to get you fitted for the New World Order." He squeezed my shoulder, his thumb pressing into a nerve with agonizing precision. "And Arthur," he whispered, his eyes turning into chips of flint, "if you so much as whisper to the police, I'll make sure Elena spends the rest of her life in a cage. And Clara, well, Clara's treatment can become a lot more permanent." I looked at my wife, then at the man who had stolen my life. I knew then that I couldn't fight him as a businessman. I had to fight him as a ghost. I looked Silas dead in the eye and let my body go limp. I forced my eyes to glaze over, letting out a long, shuddering moan as I collapsed into his arms. "The light," I stammered, playing the part of the brain-damaged victim, Grace, is that you? Silas let out a laugh, a cold, metallic sound. See, he's already slipping away. Get him back to the hospital. And Elena? Get back to those floors. They're still filthy. As they loaded me into a black SUV, I caught one last glimpse of my wife. She was back on her knees, the brush moving in a frantic, desperate rhythm. But as the door closed, I felt something in the pocket of the janitor's jacket I'd stolen. I reached in and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. It was a receipt from a local pharmacy, dated 3 days before my accident. It was for a prescription of high-dose sedatives. The patient's name wasn't mine. It was Silas Vane's. And at the bottom, in messy, hurried handwriting, were 3 words that changed everything. The brakes. Bon, home PM. I didn't know it yet, but the man Silas Vane thought he'd broken was about to become his worst nightmare. The hospital room felt smaller now, the walls closing in with every tick of the clock. I lay perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, mimicking the vacant stare of a man whose mind was still trapped in the fog. It was the only armor I had left. If Silas Vane thought I was a threat, I'd be dead before the sun went down. If he thought I was a vegetable, I might just live long enough to burn his world to the ground. Sarah Miller, the night nurse, moved quietly around the room. She was a grounded, classic Chicago woman, kind eyes, steady hands, and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded me of the 4 men I used to hire at the steel mills. She didn't look at me with the pity the others did. She looked at me like a person. "I know you're in there, Mr. Sterling," she whispered as she checked my IV drip. Her voice was barely a breath. "I saw you leave. I saw you come back. I won't tell a soul, but you need to be careful. Silas has ears everywhere in this hospital. He's been paying for extra security on this floor for 3 years. It's not to keep people out, Arthur. It's to keep you in." I didn't blink. I couldn't afford to, not with the security camera tucked into the corner of the ceiling. But my heart hammered against my ribs. Sarah was an ally. I needed one. I tucked the crumpled receipt, the evidence of my own murder attempt, deeper into the crease of the mattress. As the sedative she gave me began to pull me into a shallow sleep, my mind drifted back to the beginning. I had to understand how a snake like Silas had ever made it into my garden. It started 7 years ago. Silas Vane wasn't a Vane back then. He was just Silas, a sharp-featured, hungry project manager I'd hired to oversee the South Side expansion. He was gritty, hardened by a childhood in the rougher parts of Gary, Indiana. And he had a mind like a steel trap for logistics. I liked him. I saw a younger version of myself in his hustle. That was my first mistake. I invited him to the house for a summer barbecue. I remember Clara, my daughter, laughing as she showed him the gardens Grace had planted. Clara was soft, artistic, a soul made of light and empathy. She was the heiress to a fortune she didn't want, and Silas was a man who wanted everything. I saw the way he looked at her. It wasn't love. It was the look a prospector gives a vein of gold. I should have fired him that night. I should have escorted him to the gate and told him never to look at my daughter again. But Clara was smitten. She told me Silas made her feel seen, like she wasn't just Arthur Sterling's daughter. "He's different, Dad," she'd said, her eyes bright with a dangerous hope. "He's had it hard. He just needs someone to believe in him." I let my love for her cloud my judgment. Within a year, they were married. Within 2 years, Silas had worked his way into the executive suite at Sterling Iron. He started whispering about modernization and aggressive acquisitions. He wanted to move away from the grit of steel and into the digital shadows of logistics and predatory lending. "You're old school, Arthur," he'd tell me over glasses of expensive scotch in my study. "The world doesn't build things anymore. It moves things. It owns things. We need to be the ones holding the keys." I'd laughed it off, thinking he was just ambitious. But then came the warnings I'd ignored. My old head of security, a man named Jax Blackwood, the father of the man I'd seen mocking Elena in the lobby, had come to me with a folder. "Mr. Sterling," Jax had said, his voice gravelly and low, "Silas is moving money, small amounts, hidden in maintenance shell companies. And he's been meeting with some, let's just say, unrefined individuals in the East Heights, people who specialize in making problems disappear." I dismissed Jax. I told him he was being paranoid, that Silas was family. A week later, Jax was found dead in a hit-and-run on the Dan Ryan Expressway. The investigation went nowhere. I told myself it was a tragedy. Now, lying in this hospital bed, I knew it was a message. The tension in the family had grown like a cancer. Elena, usually so vibrant, became withdrawn. She told me she felt like Silas was watching her. She'd find him standing in the dark in the kitchen at high, Coma a.m., just staring at the wall. Clara, meanwhile, was glowing. She was pregnant. We were going to have a grandson, Leo. She wanted to name him after my father. Then came that Friday in October. I was driving to our lake house in Lake Geneva. It was a clear day, the air crisp and smelling of turning leaves. I'd just had the Mercedes serviced. Everything was perfect. I hit the long, steep descent on Highway Namui, the one that leads down toward the water. I pressed the brake to slow for the curve. The pedal went straight to the floor. I pumped it frantically. Nothing. I tried to downshift, but the transmission felt like it had been jammed. The car gained speed Salmui, Baimui, Tamui, miles per hour. The world became a blur of green and gray. My last thought wasn't about the company or the money. It was about Clara's baby. I'd promised to build him a cradle out of the oak tree in the backyard. Then came the impact. Then came the 5 years of nothing. Arthur, the voice snapped me back to the present. I shifted my gaze, keeping it slow and dull. Silas was back. He wasn't alone this time. He was pushing a wheelchair, and in it sat Clara. My heart nearly broke. My daughter, once the life of every room, looked like a porcelain doll that had been smashed and glued back together. She was thin, her skin sallow, her eyes glazed over with a heavy pharmaceutical fog. She looked at me, but she didn't see me. "See, Clara?" Silas said, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder. "Your father is back. He's a bit empty, but he's here, just like the doctors promised." Clara's hand twitched in her lap. She tried to speak, her lips moving silently, but no sound came out. "She's been very sick, Arthur," Silas said, turning his attention to me. He leaned over the bed, his face inches from mine. I could smell the expensive peppermint on his breath, a scent that now turned my stomach. The loss of the baby, it broke her. Postpartum psychosis, the doctors called it. Such a shame. She had to be institutionalized for a while. I've been taking care of her, of course, just like I've been taking care of Elena and the company. He reached out and tapped the box on my nightstand, the one containing the blue shirt. "Don't forget about the party, Arthur. 1 week. The Sterling Vane merger gala. Every major player in Chicago will be there. You're going to be my guest of honor. We'll put you in that Navy Oxford, sit you in a nice, comfortable chair, and you'll show the world that the Sterling legacy is in good hands." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "I know you're awake, Arthur. I know you're playing the quiet man. It's a good trick. But remember this. I have your wife scrubbing floors and your daughter drugged to the gills. If you so much as blink at the wrong time during that gala, I'll tell the nurses to up Clara's dosage. She'll never wake up again. Do we have an understanding?" I didn't answer. I didn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on a spot on the wall behind him. Silas chuckled and stood up. "Good. I like you better this way. You were always too loud when you were healthy." He turned the wheelchair around and began to push Clara out of the room. As they reached the door, Clara's head lolled to the side. For a split second, the fog in her eyes cleared. She looked directly at me, and her hand made a tiny, desperate gesture. She pointed toward the hem of her own dress. Then they were gone. I waited until the sound of the elevator died away. Then, with a groan of pure agony, I rolled onto my side and reached for the call button. But I didn't press it. I reached further, my fingers brushing against the box Silas had left. I pulled the shirt out. It was beautiful, navy blue, Egyptian cotton, with a subtle sheen that caught the light. But as I ran my hands over the fabric, I felt it. The collar was stiff, too stiff. There was a slight, crystalline crunch when I pressed the fabric together. I looked at the door, then back at the shirt. Grace's warning screamed in my mind. I took the small silver nail clippers from my bedside kit and began to pick at the seam of the collar. A fine, white powder began to spill out onto the white hospital sheets. It was odorless, almost invisible against the linen, but as a single drop of my sweat fell onto it, the powder turned a violent, bruised purple. I realized then what the treatment for Clara was, and I realized what Silas was planning for the gala. He didn't want me to sit in a chair as a figurehead. He wanted me to die on stage, in front of the cameras, to finalize his ascent. What happened next changed everything. I heard a soft knock at the door. I scrambled to hide the shirt, but it was too late. The door opened, and Sarah Miller stepped in. She saw the shirt, she saw the purple stain, and she saw the look in my eyes, the look of a man who was no longer a ghost. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice shaking as she locked the door behind her. "I just checked Clara's charts. Silas isn't giving her antidepressants. He's giving her the same thing he's been putting in your feeding tube for the last 6 months." "What?" I rasped, my voice finally cracking the silence of the room. "It's a slow-acting neurotoxin, Arthur. It doesn't kill you, it just keeps you compliant. But there's something else. I found a note tucked into Clara's file. It was from your wife, Elena. She's been sneaking into the records room." She handed me a crumpled piece of paper. On it was a floor plan of the Sterling Vein building, and a single, frantic sentence written in Elena's hand. "He's not just taking the company. He's selling the ironworks to the Kensington Syndicate. The explosives are already in the basement." I stared at the paper. The Kensington Syndicate. They weren't businessmen. They were a demolition and urban renewal front for the underworld. Silas wasn't just merging my company, he was going to blow it up for the insurance money, with my family inside. "Sarah," I said, my voice cold and hard as the steel I'd spent my life forging, "I need you to get me a phone, and I need you to find Jax Blackwood's son, not the one in the lobby. The other one. The one who went into the police academy." I didn't know it yet, but the blue shirt wasn't the only trap Silas had set. And as I looked at the purple stain on my bed, I realized that to save my daughter, I was going to have to do the one thing I promised Grace I'd never do. I was going to have to become the monster Silas thought I already was. The silence of the hospital at 3 a.m. is a heavy, living thing. It's the sound of held breath and fading heartbeats. Sarah Miller had kept her word, sneaking a burner phone into my room tucked inside a hollowed-out medical journal. She stood by the door, her eyes darting to the hallway as I dialed the number she'd scrawled on a piece of gauze. "Yeah?" a voice answered. It was gravelly, defensive, and weary. It was the voice of a man who had seen too much of Chicago's underbelly. "Garrett," I whispered, my vocal cords straining. "It's Arthur Sterling." There was a long, agonizing silence on the other end. I could hear a lighter flick, then the heavy exhale of smoke. "Mr. Sterling, my old man died for you. They told me you were a vegetable. They told me you were never coming back." "I'm back, Garrett. And your father didn't die for me, he was murdered for what he knew. I'm standing in the middle of the same trap now. I need the man his father raised. I'm a beat cop in the Moorhaith district, Arthur. Not a miracle worker," Garrett Blackwood replied, but the edge in his voice had softened. "What do you need?" "I need eyes on Silas Vane. I need to know about the Kensington Syndicate. And I need you to get into the records of the Lakeside Clinic. My daughter is being held there under a restorative care order. I think they're killing her, Garrett, just like they tried to kill me." "Lakeside," Garrett grunted. "That's not a clinic. That's a fortress for the wealthy who want their problems to disappear quietly. Silas has deep pockets, Arthur. He's playing in the big leagues now. He's partnered with the Montgomery family. Old money. They own half the city's real estate." The Montgomerys. Harrison Montgomery had been my rival for 30 years. He was the kind of man who wore white gloves to hide the blood on his hands. If Silas had partnered with them, he wasn't just stealing my company, he was being used as a blunt instrument to dismantle my life's work and clear the way for a corporate empire. "I'll see what I can find," Garrett said. "But Arthur, if you're really awake, you stay that way. Don't let them put that needle in you again. If you go under one more time, you aren't coming back." The line went dead. The next few days were a masterclass in agony. With Sarah's help, I began my secret recovery. Every time the security guards Silas hired went on their smoke breaks, I was out of bed. I used the heavy metal frame of the sink to do standing rows. I practiced my gait, dragging my unresponsive left leg until the feeling began to tingle back into the toes. The pain was exquisite, a hot, searing reminder that I was still alive. I had to be ready for the gala. I had to be strong enough to stand without a cane, to look Silas in the eye and let him see the man he had failed to kill. But as my body strengthened, my mind began to piece together the fragments of the past 5 years. I remembered the Sunday dinners before the accident. Silas had been so attentive, so charming. He'd bring Elena rare orchids and talk to me about the Sterling legacy. He'd play the doting husband to Clara, rubbing her pregnant belly and talking about the little prince who would one day run the mills. I realized now it was all a performance. Every smile was a calculation. Every gesture of affection was a probe for weakness. He had isolated us, one by one. He'd convinced me that Jax Blackwood was losing it, He'd convinced Elena that I was overworking myself and needed a long vacation. And Clara, God, Clara. She had been so vulnerable in those final months of pregnancy. Silas had hired a private midwife for her, a woman named Miller, who I now realized was likely an enforcer in a nurse's uniform. I was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps. I scrambled back into bed, pulling the thin hospital blanket over my trembling, sweat-slicked limbs just as the door swung open. It wasn't Silas. It was Jax's son, Garrett Blackwood. He was dressed in a worn leather jacket, his eyes shadowed by a baseball cap. He didn't look like a cop. He looked like a man who was ready to break some bones. Sarah followed him in, looking terrified. "You look like hell, Arthur," Garrett said, leaning against the doorframe. "I feel like a man who's been buried alive," I rasped. "What did you find?" Garrett walked to the bed and dropped a thick envelope onto my lap. "You were right about the accident." I went back to the impound records. "The forensics on your Mercedes were scrubbed, but I found the guy who towed it. He's a drunk now, living in a trailer in Cicero. He told me that when he hooked your car, the brake fluid was bright green, pure synthetic, the kind used in high-end racing kits. It's designed to dissolve standard seals after a few hours of heat exposure." My jaw tightened. "And the Kensington Syndicate?" Garrett's expression turned grim. "They aren't just developers, they're a liquidation crew. Silas has signed over the deeds to the Sterling Iron Works as collateral for a massive loan. But the loan isn't for the company. It's for a shell corporation called Vane Montgomery Holdings. They're going to let Sterling Iron go bankrupt, claim the insurance on the accidental destruction of the main foundry, and then build a num-chum-million luxury complex on the land. The explosives Elena mentioned," I whispered. "They're already there, Arthur, disguised as seismic testing equipment for the new foundation. The demolition is scheduled for next Saturday, the night of the gala." The sheer scale of the cruelty was breathtaking. Silas wasn't just stealing the money. He was going to erase every trace of what I had built, and he was going to use the gala as his alibi. He'd be on stage with the miracle man Arthur Sterling, while miles away, the heartbeat of my company was turned into a crater. "And Clara?" I asked, my voice breaking. Garrett hesitated. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a grainy photograph. It was Clara, seen through a high-fenced window at the lakeside clinic. She was sitting in a garden, but her hands were strapped to the arms of her chair. Beside her stood Silas, leaning down to kiss her forehead, while a nurse stood by with a tray of syringes. "She's alive, Arthur, but she's not there. They've got her on a cocktail of Thorazine and something else I can't identify. But here's the kicker. I checked the birth records for that lost baby." I held my breath. "There is no death certificate, Arthur. There's no record of a stillbirth or a neonatal death at any hospital in the state." I stared at him, the world spinning. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Silas told Clara the baby died. I'm saying he told you the baby died. But I found a private adoption file through a law firm the Montgomerys use. A healthy baby boy was placed with an anonymous family in Sterling Heights the same day Clara supposedly lost hers. The rage that surged through me wasn't hot. It was a cold, absolute zero. Silas Vane hadn't just tried to kill me. He hadn't just enslaved my wife and drugged my daughter. He had stolen my grandson and sold him like a piece of equipment to solidify his ties to the old money elites. "I didn't know it yet," I said, my voice sounding like grinding stone. "But Silas Vane just signed his own death warrant." "What's the move, Arthur?" Garrett asked, his hand drifting to the holster at his waist. "The gala is in 3 days. Silas wants me to wear that blue shirt. He wants me to have a relapse on stage, a final, tragic heart attack that leaves him as the sole executor of the Sterling estate." I looked at the navy Oxford shirt sitting on the nightstand, its poisoned collar glinting in the moonlight. "We're going to give him exactly what he wants," I said, "but we're changing the script. Sarah, I need you to get me a very specific list of medications. Garrett, I need you to find that baby, and I need a way to get Elena out of that building for 1 hour." "Arthur, you're barely walking," Sarah whispered. "If you try to take him on at the gala, he'll have 20 security guards who will shoot you before you reach the podium." "I'm not going to reach for him," I said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. "I'm going to make him reach for me, and when he does, the whole city is going to watch him burn." Garrett nodded, a spark of respect in his eyes. "My old man always said you were the toughest son of a bitch in Chicago. Don't prove him wrong now." They left as quietly as they had arrived. I lay there in the dark, the burner phone clutched in my hand. I thought about Grace, standing in the silver light of my coma, warning me about the shirt. She hadn't just been protecting me. She had been giving me the key to the trap. I reached out and touched the Egyptian cotton of the Navy Oxford. It felt like silk. It felt like death. I began to unpick the collar again, but this time, I wasn't just removing the powder. I was replacing it. I was about to learn that when you push a man into a grave, you'd better make sure he's dead. Because if he climbs back out, he's not coming for an apology. He's coming for everything. The next morning the door opened, and Silas walked in. He looked jubilant, his eyes bright with the triumph of a man who thinks he's already won. "Big day, Arthur. The tailor is here to make sure that shirt fits your, too reduced frame. We want you looking like the king you used to be." He stepped aside, and a man in a prestigious-looking suit walked in, carrying a measuring tape. But as the man leaned over to measure my neck, he whispered something that made my skin crawl. "The Montgomerys send their regards, Mr. Sterling. They said to tell you that the view from the top of Vane Tower is breathtaking, especially when you're looking down at the ruins." I looked past him at Silas, who was scrolling through his phone, oblivious. What happened next changed everything, I thought to myself, because I wasn't the only one who had a secret guest in this room. I looked at the tailor, and I realized I knew him. He wasn't a tailor. He was the man who had been driving the car that killed Jax Blackwood. The wolf was in the room, and he didn't realize I had already sharpened my teeth. The tailor's hands were ice cold. As he draped the measuring tape around my neck, I could feel the rough calluses on his fingertips, the kind of hands that didn't belong to a man who spent his days in a boutique on Oak Street. These were hands that knew the weight of a lead pipe and the cold grip of a steering wheel. This was Vance, the man Garrett had identified as the driver who ran Jax Blackwood off the Dan Ryan. I sat in my wheelchair, my head lolling slightly to the left, my jaw slack. It was a performance that required every ounce of my willpower. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to wrap my fingers around his throat and squeeze until the life left his eyes. But I remained a statue, a hollowed-out shell of the man I used to be. 17.5 inches, Vance muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and something metallic. "You've got a thick neck for a man who's been melting away for 5 years, Sterling. It's a shame. A neck like this. It's built for a rope." Silas laughed from across the room, not looking up from his tablet. "Don't be macabre, Vance. Arthur is a Chicago legend. We want the collar to be snug, but not restrictive. He needs to be able to breathe, at least for the first half of the ceremony." The implication was as sharp as a razor. Silas wasn't even hiding it anymore. In his mind, I was already dead. The gala was just the funeral I happened to be attending in person. I didn't know it yet, but the level of his arrogance was going to be the very thing that handed me the match to light his funeral pyre. Once the tailor finished his measurements and Silas escorted him out, the room fell into a silence that felt like a burial. I waited 10 minutes, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then I heard the familiar jingle of keys and the heavy, rhythmic thud of an industrial mop bucket. The door pushed open. Elena didn't look at the bed. She kept her head down, her gray janitor's jumpsuit hanging off her thin frame. She began to mop the floor in wide, desperate strokes, the scent of industrial-grade bleach filling the air. "Elena!" I whispered. She froze. The mop clattered against the bucket. She looked at the security camera in the corner, then back at me, her eyes wide with a terror that broke my heart. "Don't," she mouthed silently. I looked at the camera and then back at her, giving her a slow, deliberate wink. I'd noticed something Sarah Miller had pointed out earlier. The red light on the camera flickered every 30 seconds, a reset in the hospital's aging digital loop. I had a 30-second window every minute. "The basement," I whispered during the first flicker. "Tell me about the ironworks." Elena moved closer to the bed, pretending to scrub a stubborn stain near my feet. Her voice was a frantic hiss. "They're moving everything, Arthur. The Montgomerys. They brought in men from the Kensington Syndicate. They're not just demolition crews. They're soldiers. They've been clearing out the old records, the ones from your father's time. Silas says there's a secret in the foundation of the main foundry. He's obsessed with it." "What secret?" I asked during the next flicker. "I don't know," she sobbed silently, tears dripping onto the marble floor. "But he's scared, Arthur. For all his bravado, he's terrified of what's under that building. He thinks if he blows it up, the secret stays buried, And Clara, he's moving her. Tomorrow. They're taking her to a private wing at the Kensington estate. The Kensington estate. That was a fortress. If Silas got her behind those walls, I'd never get her out. Listen to me, I said, my voice gaining a strength that surprised even me. Tomorrow morning, when you come in to clean, there will be a bag under the trash liner in the bathroom. It has a phone and a key. Take them. Go to the old foundry, the one on Bonmabaith. Find the foreman's locker, number Mochumle Bon. The code is Grace's birthday. Arthur, I can't, she whispered. Vane's men, they watch me every second. They watch a janitor, I corrected. They don't watch the woman who built Sterling Iron alongside me. Remember who you are, Elena. You aren't his slave. You're my wife. Now, get out before the loop resets. She straightened her back, a flicker of the old Elena, the woman who could command a room of 1,000 people returning to her eyes for a fleeting second. She grabbed her mop and vanished into the hallway just as the camera's red light burned steady again. That night, Garrett Blackwood returned, but he wasn't alone. He brought a man I hadn't seen in years, Silas's own brother, Jax. No, not Jax. It was Miller Garrett, a classic, grounded man who had been Silas's first business partner before Silas had betrayed him and left him for dead in a fraudulent bankruptcy scheme. Miller looked at me with a grim nod. I heard the ghost was walking again. Silas always was a sloppy killer. He leaves too many loose ends. Miller, I rasped. I thought you were in Seattle. I was, until Garrett told me Silas was trying to sell the ironworks to the Kensingtons. Do you know why he's so desperate to blow that building, Arthur? I shook my head. Miller leaned in, his face shadowed. It's not just about the insurance or the luxury condos. When you bought that land from the city, back in the 80s, there was a discrepancy in the soil reports. Your father found something the Montgomerys have been trying to recover for 50 years. It's a ledger, Arthur. A ledger that proves the Montgomery fortune isn't old money, it's stolen money. Civil War gold that was supposed to go to the reconstruction of Chicago, buried under the old foundry. The pieces fell into place with a sickening thud. Silas wasn't just a predator, he was a scavenger. He had found out about the ledger through Clara's old family journals, and made a deal with the Montgomerys to recover it while destroying the evidence of its existence. My life, my company, my daughter's sanity, all of it was collateral for a cache of blood-stained gold. What happened next changed everything, Miller said, his voice cold. Because the Kensingtons aren't waiting for the gala anymore. They moved the demolition up. They're blowing the foundry tonight. Tonight? I sat bolt upright, the pain in my spine a secondary concern to the adrenaline coursing through me. Elena is going there. I sent her there. We have to move, Garrett said, checking his service weapon. But Arthur, if you leave this hospital now, Silas will know. The moment you trip that security perimeter, he'll call the clinic and give the order for Clara. I looked at the navy Oxford shirt sitting on the nightstand. The poisoned shirt. A plan formed in my mind, a desperate, high-stakes gamble that relied on the one person Silas had overlooked. Sarah, I called out. The nurse stepped in, her face pale. I heard. I'm ready. I need you to swap the IV now. Give me the stimulant we discussed. And then, I need you to put someone in this bed, someone who looks like a ghost. 10 minutes later, a retired construction worker from the floor below, a man with no family and a terminal diagnosis, who had agreed to help for a hefty donation to the hospice, was tucked into my bed, his head turned away from the camera. I stood up, my legs shaking but holding. I traded my hospital gown for a set of Garrett's spare clothes. As I moved toward the door, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I didn't see a victim. I saw a man who had spent 40 years forging iron. I saw a Sterling. We slipped out through the service elevator, moving through the dark, rain-slicked streets of Chicago toward the south side. The city felt different, colder, sharper. The Vane signs seemed to mock me from every corner. When we reached the perimeter of the Sterling Iron Works, the air was thick with the scent of diesel and ozone. High-powered floodlights cut through the fog, illuminating the massive silhouette of the old foundry. Black SUVs with Kensington plates were parked in a semicircle around the main entrance. There, Garrett whispered, pointing toward a small service door. I saw her. Elena was standing near the foreman's lockers, her janitor's jacket discarded. She was holding a heavy iron pry bar, her face set in a mask of grim determination. She had found the locker. She was reaching for the ledger. But behind her, emerging from the shadows of the massive smelting pots, was Silas Vane. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing tactical gear, a suppressed pistol in his hand. He looked at Elena not with love or even hatred, but with the cold detachment of a man swatting a fly. "I knew you'd come here, Elena." Silas's voice echoed through the hollow foundry. "You always were the sentimental one. You just couldn't let the old man's secrets die, could you?" "You're a monster, Silas," Elena cried, clutching a small, leather-bound book to her chest. "Arthur trusted you. Clara loved you. Trust is for the weak, and love is for the poor," Silas sneered, stepping into the light. "I'm neither. Now, give me the ledger. If you do, I might let you live long enough to watch the building go up. It'll be a beautiful sight, Elena, the end of the Sterlings." He raised the pistol, aiming it directly at my wife's heart. I stepped out of the shadows, the rain dripping from my chin, my voice a roar that shook the very foundation of the building. "Drop the gun, Silas." Silas froze. He turned slowly, his eyes widening as he saw me standing there, no wheelchair, no vacant stare, just the man who had built the floor he was standing on. "Arthur," he whispered, his voice cracking. How are you standing?" "I'm a Sterling, you son of a bitch," I said, stepping forward. "And we don't break as easily as you think." But Silas's shock lasted only a second. A cruel, jagged smile spread across his face. "You should have stayed in the hospital, Arthur, because now you get to die twice." He reached for a small remote detonator strapped to his belt. "You see, the explosives aren't just for the foundation, they're wired to this entire floor. And I've already sent the signal to the clinic. Clara is as good as dead." My blood turned to ice. "What did you do?" "I gave her a special dose, Arthur. The same one that's in that blue shirt I left for you. In 5 minutes, she'll go into cardiac arrest. And in 10 seconds, this building becomes a pile of rubble." He pressed the button. A low, guttural hum began to vibrate through the floor, the sound of a countdown. But as Silas laughed, his thumb still pressed to the detonator, his expression suddenly shifted from triumph to agonizing confusion. He looked down at his own hand. The skin around his thumb was turning a violent, bruised purple. He let out a choked scream, dropping the detonator as his hand began to spasm uncontrollably. What is this?" he gasped, clutching his wrist. I stepped closer, my eyes locked on his. "You liked that Navy Oxford so much, Silas, that I decided to share. Sarah Miller didn't just help me recover. She helped me treat your gifts. I rubbed a concentrated dose of your own contact poison onto that detonator before I left the hospital. Every time you touched it tonight, you were feeding yourself your own death." Silas collapsed to his knees, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. But as I moved to grab Elena and run, a voice boomed from the shadows of the upper catwalks. "It's a poetic ending, Sterling, but you forgot one thing." I looked up. Standing there, flanked by 4 armed mercenaries, was Harrison Montgomery. He held a second remote in his hand, the master detonator. "Silas was always a disposable tool," Montgomery said, his voice as smooth as aged cognac. "The ledger is all I need. And now that you've been so kind as to find it for me." He gestured to his men. "Kill them all, and blow the building." The mercenaries raised their rifles. I threw myself in front of Elena, waiting for the impact. What happened next changed everything. The sound of the first shot didn't come from the catwalk. It came from the shadows behind Montgomery. A man in a tattered leather jacket stepped into the light, a sniper rifle leveled at Montgomery's head. It was Jax Blackwood. My head of security wasn't dead, and he wasn't alone. The muzzle flash from the catwalk was a strobe light in the gloom, illuminating the shock on Harrison Montgomery's face for a fraction of a second before the world erupted into chaos. Montgomery didn't fall. He dove behind a steel structural beam as the bullet from Jax's rifle sparked off the iron railing. "Jax," I yelled, my voice barely audible over the sudden thunder of gunfire. "Get her down, Arthur. Move." Jax screamed from the shadows. He looked like a ghost that had clawed its way out of the Chicago soil, haggard, bearded, and wearing a tactical vest that looked like it had seen a dozen wars. I didn't think. I grabbed Elena by the waist and threw both of us behind a massive, rusted smelting pot. Bullets hissed through the air, clanging against the heavy iron like 1,000 hammers hitting an anvil. The scent of ozone and cordite replaced the smell of decay. Behind us, Silas Vane was a pathetic heap on the concrete, his body racked by the neurotoxin he'd intended for me. He was clutching his purple-tinged hand, his eyes rolling back in his head, his breath coming in a series of wet, Rhythmic clicks. You were supposed to be dead, Silas wheezed, looking at me with a mixture of agony and disbelief. The car, the report. Reports can be bought, Silas. Especially in this city, I spat, checking the perimeter. I spent 40 years learning which cops take a paycheck and which ones take a stand. Garrett didn't just find a witness, he found his father. We faked the hit and run to get Jax into the deep cover he needed to track your Montgomery friends. Up on the catwalk, the Kensington mercenaries weren't interested in conversation. They were professional cleaners, and we were the mess. They fanned out, using the height advantage to pin us down. Garrett, status. I barked into the radio Jax had tossed near me. Perimeter is compromised, Garrett's voice crackled through, punctuated by the sound of sirens in the distance. I've got the Moor-Haith district rolling in, but Montgomery has his own people inside the dispatch. Half the units coming your way are on the Vane Montgomery payroll. Do not trust the uniforms. I looked at Elena. She was clutching the leather-bound ledger to her chest as if it were a shield. Her knuckles were white, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes were burning with a fire I hadn't seen in half a decade. Arthur, she whispered, the timer, Silas's detonator. I looked at the small device Silas had dropped. The red digital display was humming. Hum, bon muy lum, hum, bon muy bon. The building was wired. In less than a minute, this entire foundry, the physical embodiment of the Sterling legacy, would be nothing but a memory and a insurance claim. Jax, we have 40 seconds, I roared. I see it, Jax yelled back. He was moving along the shadows of the upper pipes, picking off Montgomery's men with surgical precision. Montgomery is making a break for the south exit. He's got the master remote. Go after him, I told Elena. Stay low. Get to the service tunnel. I have to get the detonator. Arthur, no, she cried, but I was already moving. I didn't have the strength I used to, but adrenaline is a hell of a drug. I lunged from behind the smelting pot, staying low to the ground. A mercenary on the catwalk spotted me, his rifle tracking my movement, but a shot from Jax's position took the man's shoulder out before he could pull the trigger. I reached Silas, who was now barely conscious, his skin a mottled, sickly gray. I grabbed the detonator from his twitching fingers. My hand brushed against his skin, and I felt a jolt of pure, cold hatred. I could have left him there to blow up with the building. It would have been justice. It would have been easy. But I needed him alive. I needed him to testify. I needed him to tell me exactly where he'd hidden my grandson. I grabbed Silas by the collar of his tactical vest and began to drag him. He was a dead weight, and my lungs felt like they were filling with hot lead. Không, hai mươi, không, 19. Arthur, move. Garrett's voice roared from the entrance. He appeared in the doorway, a shotgun in his hands, clearing a path through the smoke. I dragged Silas toward the service tunnel where Elena was waiting. Behind us, the foundry began to groan. The seismic equipment Silas had installed wasn't just for show. It was vibrating the very atoms of the foundation, weakening the structural integrity before the final blast. The ledger, a voice boomed. I looked up to see Harrison Montgomery standing on the landing of the south exit, his silver hair disheveled, his prestigious suit torn. He held the master remote high. You think a few old men and a beat cop can stop the Montgomerys? This city belongs to us. It was built on our terms. It was built on stolen gold, Harrison, I shouted back, still hauling Silas's limp body. And the receipts are in my wife's hands. Montgomery's face contorted with a primal rage. He didn't wait for his men. He didn't wait for the ledger. He pressed the master override. If I can't have the past, you won't have a future. Hum, nam, hum, bon. I threw Silas into the tunnel and lunged in after him, pulling Elena down and shielding her with my body. The explosion wasn't a single bang. It was a rhythmic, rolling series of thuds that felt like the earth itself was coughing. The ground buckled. A shock wave of heat and dust roared through the tunnel, slamming into us like a physical wall. I heard the scream of twisting metal, the sound of 40 years of my life collapsing into the basement. Silence followed. A thick, heavy, poisoned silence filled with the taste of pulverized concrete and old secrets. I coughed, my vision swimming. I reached out, my hand finding Elena's. She was shaking, but she was alive. The ledger? I croaked. I have it, she whispered. We crawled out from the debris of the tunnel. The foundry was gone. A massive plume of black smoke was rising into the Chicago night, illuminated by the flashing lights of 100 police cars and fire trucks. But Garrett was right, the uniforms were divided. I saw officers standing with their weapons drawn, not at the fire, but at each other. The thin blue line was fracturing right in front of us. "Where's Montgomery?" I asked, looking around the ruins. "He's gone," Jack said, appearing from the wreckage. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but his eyes were sharp. He slipped out through the Kensington transport before the blast, but he left something behind. He gestured to the ground. There, lying in the dirt, was Montgomery's master remote. It had been crushed by falling debris, but the screen was still flickering. "Arthur," Jack said, his voice dropping to a somber tone. "The remote wasn't just for the explosives, it was a transmitter. It was linked to the Lakeside Clinic." My heart plummeted. "Clara." The moment he pressed that button, it sent a signal to the automated medication dispensers in her wing. Jax explained. "It's a failsafe the Montgomerys use for their high-profile guests. If the estate is threatened, the patients are neutralized." I looked at the flickering remote. We had no way of knowing if the signal had been received or if the countdown to my daughter's death had already started. "Garrett, we need a bird! Now!" I screamed. "I've got a helicopter on the way, but it's a 5-minute flight and the clinic is 10 minutes out by air," Garrett said, his face pale. "And Arthur, there's more." He held up his own phone, showing a live news feed. The headline made my blood run cold. "Chief of Police declares state of emergency. Sterling Iron Works blast labeled as domestic terrorism by Arthur Sterling. They're pinning it on you." Elena gasped. "Silas and Montgomery. They've already flipped the narrative. You're not the victim anymore, Arthur. You're the fugitive." I looked at the ruins of my company, then at the dying man at my feet, and finally at the sky where the helicopter was descending. I didn't have 5 minutes. I didn't have 10. I had a daughter who was being murdered by a computer script and a city that now thought I was a monster. I didn't know it yet, I thought, the cold Chicago wind biting at my face. But the real betrayal wasn't the explosion. It was the fact that Silas Vane wasn't the one in charge. I reached into Silas's vest and pulled out his encrypted phone. I used his thumb, the one that wasn't purple, to unlock it. The last outgoing message wasn't to Montgomery. It was to a woman named Tessa. "The old man is out. Secure the asset. Move the boy to the Sterling Heights vault. The Kensington era begins tonight." Tessa. The name hit me like a physical blow. Tessa wasn't a business partner. She was the private midwife who had told Clara her baby was dead. And she was the one woman Grace had warned me about in our first year of marriage, the one who had almost destroyed Sterling Iron before it ever began. "Jax," I said, my voice as cold as the iron in the ground. "Change of plans. We aren't going to the clinic. We're going to the one place they think I'll never find." "Where?" "My father's old hunting lodge in Sterling Heights." "The vault." "It's not a vault for money, Jax. It's where my father kept the original deeds to the city." I looked at the ledger Elena held. "And I think I know why Silas couldn't read the ledger. It's not written in English." "What is it then?" Elena asked. "It's written in the code of the foundrymen, a language only a Sterling knows." I climbed into the helicopter, the roar of the rotors drowning out the sirens. As we lifted off over the burning ruins of my legacy, I looked down at the city I loved. It was beautiful, but it was rotting from the inside out. "Hang on, Clara," I whispered. "Grandpa's coming home, and he's bringing a hammer." What happened next changed everything, because as we flew towards Sterling Heights, I realized the helicopter pilot wasn't one of Garrett's men. He was wearing a Kensington patch on his flight suit, and he was locking the cabin doors. The vibration of the helicopter rotors felt like a rhythmic pounding inside my skull, a mechanical heartbeat that was the only thing keeping me grounded as the city of Chicago shrank beneath us. I looked at the pilot, his posture rigid, his eyes obscured by dark aviators. When he locked those cabin doors with a sharp, electronic click, the air in the small space suddenly turned frigid. It wasn't just the altitude, it was the realization that I had traded one cage for another. "Jax," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Jax Blackwood was already ahead of me. His hand was drifting toward the waistband of his trousers, but the pilot didn't even look back. He simply tilted his head toward the side view mirror, where a second helicopter, a sleek, black bird with no markings, was flanking us. "I wouldn't do that, Mr. Blackwood," the pilot said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The Kensington Syndicate doesn't like loose ends. If this bird doesn't follow the flight path, the other one has orders to take us out over the lake. No survivors. no wreckage to find in the deep water. Elena gasped, clutching the leather-bound ledger to her chest. I reached out, taking her hand in mine. Her fingers were ice cold, shaking with a terror that mirrored my own. We were trapped thousands of feet above the ground with a dying man, a traitor, and a mission that felt like it was crumbling in my hands. "Who are you working for?" I demanded, leaning forward. "Montgomery, or is it Tessa?" The pilot didn't answer for a long moment. Then, he banked the helicopter hard to the left, heading away from the city lights and toward the dark, wooded expanse of Sterling Heights. "Mr. Montgomery is a client. Tessa is a partner. There's a difference in the hierarchy, Mr. Sterling. One pays for results, the other provides the blood." I looked down at Silas Vane. He was slumped against the cabin wall, his face a ghostly shade of indigo. The contact poison was working its way through his nervous system, paralyzing him inch by inch. He tried to speak, his lips fluttering, but only a wet, gargling sound came out. It was a pathetic sight, the man who had dismantled my life, now a prisoner of his own cruelty. I felt no pity. I only felt an urgent, burning need to get to the lodge before Clara's timer ran out. I didn't know it yet, I thought, watching the forest floor rush toward us. But the pilot was right about one thing. The hierarchy was about to shift, and the blood was going to be mine. The landing was rough. We didn't head for the cleared pad at the lodge. The pilot brought us down in a secluded clearing half a mile away, the skids of the helicopter crushing the thick underbrush. The moment the rotors began to slow, the black helicopter that had been following us landed 20 yards away. 4 men in tactical gear stepped out, their rifles leveled at our windows. The pilot unlocked the doors. Out, everyone. Jax moved first, his hands raised, but his eyes were scanning the perimeter like a hawk. I helped Elena down, my legs feeling like brittle glass as I stepped onto the uneven ground. 2 of the mercenaries grabbed Silas, dragging him out like a sack of grain. They didn't care if he lived or died. They just needed him as a trophy. Standing in the center of that clearing, surrounded by the silence of the Sterling Heights woods, I hit rock bottom. My company was a smoking ruin. My daughter was miles away, potentially taking her last breaths. My grandson was a ghost in a vault. And I was standing in front of my father's old hunting lodge, the place where I had spent my happiest childhood summers, now occupied by the very people who wanted to erase the Sterling name from history. Harrison Montgomery was waiting on the porch of the lodge. He looked impeccable even in the wilderness, holding a crystal glass of bourbon that caught the moonlight. Beside him stood a woman I hadn't seen in 30 years, yet I would have known her anywhere. Tessa. She was tall, her hair a sharp, platinum blonde bob, her eyes the color of a winter sky. She didn't look like a midwife. She looked like a queen who had just reclaimed her throne. "Arthur," she said, her voice like silk over gravel. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, waking from a coma just in time to watch your world burn. It's almost poetic." "Where is the boy, Tessa?" I rasped, my throat raw. She smiled, a slow, cruel curve of her lips. "He's inside, in the vault. He's a beautiful child, Arthur. He has your father's chin. It's a shame he'll never know the Sterling name. To the world, he's Leo Kensington now, the heir to a fortune that actually matters." "You sold your own grandson for a seat at the table?" I spat at Montgomery. Montgomery laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "I didn't sell him, Arthur. I invested him. The Sterlings were a mistake of history, a bunch of ironworkers who got lucky during the boom. But the Montgomerys, we are the architects of this city. And with that ledger, we'll ensure that no one ever questions our right to rule." He stepped off the porch, his eyes locking onto the book Elena held. "Give it to me, Elena. Do it now, and I might just let the 3 of you walk into the woods. You won't have a cent to your name, but you'll have your lives." "Don't do it, Elena," I said. Elena looked at me, then at the ledger. She saw the code of the foundrymen etched into the leather, the secret language of the men who poured the steel that built the Sears Tower and the Hancock Center. She knew what was inside wasn't just a list of bribes. "He can't read it, Arthur," she said, her voice suddenly steady. "He thinks it's a map to gold. But it's not, is it?" "No," I said, a cold realization dawning on me. "It's the recipe." Montgomery's brow furrowed. "The recipe for what?" "For the collapse," I said. "My father didn't just build this city, Harrison. He knew the quality of the steel the Montgomerys used in the underground supports of the loop. He knew you skimmed the top off the construction contracts and replaced the reinforced iron with brittle, recycled scrap. This ledger isn't a map to gold, it's a structural analysis of every building you own. If this information goes public, your entire empire is condemned by the city inspectors by morning. You wouldn't just be broke, you'd be the most sued man in the history of Illinois. The silence that followed was deafening. Montgomery's hand shook, the bourbon splashing against the side of his glass. He looked at Tessa, who had gone deathly still. "Is this true?" Montgomery hissed. I didn't know it yet, I thought, but the hidden truth was the only weapon I had left, and I was about to pull the trigger. "Kill them," Tessa said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Kill them, and take the book. We'll find someone to translate it." The mercenaries raised their rifles. I closed my eyes, pulling Elena close, waiting for the end. But the sound that followed wasn't the crack of gunfire. It was the low, mournful wail of a siren, not a police siren, but the old air raid horn my father had installed on the lodge roof for emergencies. Suddenly, the woods erupted. Flashbangs detonated in a circle around the clearing, blinding the mercenaries. From the tree line, a dozen figures moved with a speed that spoke of elite training. They weren't cops. They were men in grease-stained coveralls and heavy work boots, the old guard of sterling iron. Men I had employed for decades, men who had been waiting for the signal Jax had sent out hours ago. "For the foundry!" a voice roared. It was Jax's brother, Garrett, leading a charge of retired steelworkers who had armed themselves with whatever they could find, hunting rifles, crowbars, and the sheer, unadulterated rage of men who had seen their livelihoods stolen. In the chaos, Jax lunged for the pilot, disarming him in a blur of motion. I grabbed a heavy iron fire poker from the porch and swung it with all the strength I had left, catching a mercenary across the jaw. "Elena, the vault! Get the boy!" I screamed. She didn't hesitate. She bolted toward the lodge, the ledger tucked under her arm. I followed her, my heart racing against the clock. 5 minutes. Clara had 5 minutes. We burst into the lodge. The interior was exactly as I remembered the smell of cedar and wood smoke, but the back wall had been ripped open, revealing the heavy steel door of the vault. Standing in front of it was Vance, the tailor who had tried to kill me. He held a syringe in one hand and a remote in the other. "One step closer, Sterling, and the girl dies." Vance sneered, his thumb hovering over the button that would trigger Clara's final dosage at the clinic. "And the kid in here? He'll never see the sun." I looked at Vance. I looked at the man who had murdered Jax's father and tried to turn me into a memory. I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, industrial clarity. "You're not a soldier, Vance," I said, stepping forward. "You're a delivery boy, and your delivery is late." I didn't go for the gun. I went for the control panel on the wall, the one that controlled the lodge's industrial-grade ventilation system. I smashed the glass and pulled the lever. A massive blast of pressurized Kohai, the fire suppression system for the vault, erupted from the ceiling. The room was instantly filled with a thick, white fog. Vance choked, dropping the syringe as he scrambled to find his bearings. I lunged through the mist. I didn't use the poker, I used my hands. I found his throat and pinned him against the steel door. "The code, Vance, give me the override for the clinic." "Go to hell," he gasped. "You first," I said, and I slammed his head against the vault door with a sound that echoed like a hammer on an anvil. He slumped to the floor, unconscious. I grabbed the remote from his hand. My fingers were shaking as I navigated the screen. Failsafe active. Time to release. Home, Bamui High. I punched in the only code that made sense, Grace's birthday. Access denied. My heart stopped. Home, Hai Mui Lam. "Arthur, think," Elena cried, kneeling beside me. "What did your father say?" "The foundation." "The foundation." I looked at the vault door. It wasn't just steel, it was sterling steel. I looked at the ledger. I flipped to the back page, where a series of numbers was written in the foundry code. I translated them in my head, the weight of the first pour. "Mochin Buntam." I punched the numbers into the remote. Failsafe deactivated. Dose terminated. I collapsed against the door, a sob of pure relief escaping my throat. Clara was safe. But as the Kohai mist began to clear, I heard a sound from inside the vault, a soft, rhythmic whimpering. Elena pulled the heavy handle, and the door swung open. There, sitting on a pile of old blueprints, was a 3-year-old boy with bright green eyes and a shock of dark hair. He looked at us with a curious, unafraid expression. "Grandpa?" he asked, his voice a tiny, perfect echo of the man I used to be. I reached out and scooped him into my arms, the warmth of his small body finally washing away the 5 years of cold darkness. But as I held him, a shadow fell over the vault entrance. Harrison Montgomery was standing there, his face a mask of bleeding rage. He had a backup pistol in his hand, and he was aiming it directly at the boy's head. "If I'm going down, Sterling," Montgomery whispered, "I'm taking the legacy with me." What happened next changed everything, because the person who stopped him wasn't me, and it wasn't Jax. It was Silas Vane. He had crawled into the room, his body twisted by the poison, his face a nightmare of purple and gray. With a final, agonizing effort, he grabbed Montgomery's ankle and pulled. The shot went wide, shattering a window. "My son," Silas wheezed, his eyes finding the boy for a split second before they went dull. Jax appeared behind Montgomery, his heavy boot connecting with the back of the old man's head, silencing him forever. The battle for Sterling Heights was over, but as I stood there with my grandson in my arms and my wife by my side, I realized the final twist was only just beginning. Because on Silas's phone, which I still held in my pocket, a new message flashed. It was from the Lakeside Clinic. "Patient Clara Sterling has disappeared. The facility is under lockdown. Security footage shows her leaving with a man in a prestigious white suit. He called himself Dr. Harrison." I looked down at the unconscious Harrison Montgomery. If he was here, who was with my daughter? "Jax," I said, the ice returning to my veins. Montgomery wasn't the head of the syndicate, he was the distraction. I looked at the ledger. There was one more page, one more name. The real Dr. Harrison was the man who had cured me. The cold from the vault floor seemed to seep into my marrow, turning the triumph of holding my grandson into a jagged shard of ice. I stared at the phone screen, the name Dr. Harrison, pulsing like a digital heartbeat. For 5 years that man had been the keeper of my body, the one who whispered medical updates to Elena while I was a ghost. I had trusted him with my life. I had called him a miracle worker to his face. "Arthur." Elena's voice was a fragile thread. She saw the look on my face, the same look I used to get when a structural beam showed a hairline fracture. "What is it?" "The doctor," I rasped, handing the phone to Jax. "The man who woke me up. He didn't just find a window in my consciousness, Jax. He opened it because the Montgomerys were done with the waiting. They needed me awake to sign the merger papers, to be the face of their miracle while they gutted the company." Jax looked at the screen, his jaw tightening. "Alistair Kensington. That's the real name of your doctor, Harrison. He's the youngest son of the Kensington patriarch. He didn't go into medicine to save people, Arthur. He went into medicine to learn how to break them without leaving a mark." The psychological weight of it hit me like a falling crane. My recovery wasn't a blessing. It was a scheduled extraction. Every therapy session, every encouraging word from Alistair, it was all part of a clinical study in how to steal a man's soul while his heart was still beating. He hadn't just watched me. He'd been the architect of my family's misery from the inside of the hospital walls. "He has Clara," I said, my voice dropping into a register that made the old steelworkers in the room go silent. "He's taking her back to the city, to the penthouse at Kensington Tower." "That's a fortress, Arthur," Garrett said, stepping into the lodge, his shotgun still steaming from the skirmish outside. "The lower floors are commercial, but the top 3 are a private residence. It's got its own elevator, its own security detail, and a landing pad. We can't just kick the door down." I looked at the leather-bound ledger in Elena's hands. Then I looked at the old men standing around me, the old guard, the men who had spent 40 years pouring the iron that held Chicago together. "We don't need to kick the door down," I said. "We're going to make the building scream." The drive back to Chicago was a blur of high-speed turns and whispered plans. We left the lodge in a convoy of rusted Ford trucks and one black SUV we'd liberated from the mercenaries. In the back seat, I held Leo. He had fallen asleep, his small head resting against my chest. It was a strange, beautiful weight, a reminder of what I was fighting for. Elena sat beside me, her eyes fixed on the ledger. "Arthur, how does this work? You said it's a recipe for collapse." "My father was a paranoid man, Elena. He didn't trust the city inspectors in the 50s, and he certainly didn't trust the Montgomerys. When they started building the new loop, they used sterling iron for the primary supports, but they didn't pay for the high-grade stuff. They bought the seconds iron with too much carbon, iron that was brittle. My father recorded every batch number, every pour date, and every stress test they skipped. I opened the ledger to a page marked with a hand-drawn seal of a hammer and anvil. Kensington Tower is built on a foundation of those seconds. If I enter these batch numbers into the city engineering database, the one my father helped design, it triggers an automatic red tag status. The building's smart systems will go into emergency evacuation mode. The elevators will drop to the lobby, the fire doors will seal, and the security grid will reboot. For exactly 90 seconds, the penthouse will be wide open. And, if it doesn't work, Elena asked. Then we're just a bunch of old men with a book of secrets, I said. But we're Sterlings. We don't build things that fail. We reached the outskirts of the city as the sun began to peek over Lake Michigan, casting a pale, bruised light over the skyline. Kensington Tower stood like a needle of glass and steel, mocking the older, sturdier buildings around it. It looked invincible. It looked like the future. We pulled into a parking garage 3 blocks away. Jax and Garrett began handing out headsets. The old guard fanned out, taking positions near the building's main gas and electrical feeds. They weren't soldiers, but they knew every pipe and wire in this zip code. "Arthur, wait," Elena said as I prepared to step out of the car. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket. It was the one Grace had worn every day until she died. "She warned you about the shirt. She's been watching you. Take this." I pressed the locket into my palm, feeling the cool metal. "I'm coming back with Clara, Elena, I promise." The lobby of Kensington Tower was a cathedral of arrogance. Polished obsidian floors, digital waterfalls, and guards in suits that cost 5 figures. I walked in alone, wearing the navy Oxford shirt Silas had given me, the one I had carefully neutralized and cleaned. I wanted Alistair to see me in it. I wanted him to think his plan was still on track. I didn't stop at the security desk. I walked straight to the VIP elevator. "Sir, you can't go up there," a guard said, stepping into my path. He was tall, mid-30s, with the Silas vibe of someone who thought he was untouchable. "Tell Alistair Kensington that Arthur Sterling is here for his final checkup," I said, my voice echoing through the marble hall. The guard's earpiece crackled. He looked at me, his expression shifting from annoyance to predatory curiosity. "The doctor will see you now, Mr. Sterling, but leave the attitude down here. It's a long drop from the top." The elevator ride was silent. As the floor numbers climbed, my heart rate stayed steady. I had spent 5 years in a box. A glass elevator didn't scare me. The doors opened directly into a minimalist penthouse. It was all white leather and cold glass, with a panoramic view of the lake. In the center of the room, sitting in a designer chair, was Clara. She was awake, her eyes darting around the room, but she was tied to the chair with silk scarves, a prestigious way to kidnap someone. Alistair Kensington stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a tablet in his hand. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who was about to win a Nobel Prize. "Arthur," he said, not turning around. "You're early. The press conference isn't for another 3 hours. I haven't even had the chance to prepare the relapse statement." "The relapse is cancelled, Alistair," I said, stepping into the room. He turned then, a thin smile on his face. He looked at my shirt, the navy Oxford. "I see you're wearing the gift. How does it feel? Does it itch?" "That's the toxin beginning to interact with your sweat. In about 20 minutes, your heart will start to skip. In 30, you'll be a headline. $5. I cleaned the shirt, Alistair, and I used the leftover toxin to put Silas Vane in a coma he's never coming out of." Alistair's smile didn't falter. He tapped a command on his tablet. Silas was a tool. A crude, noisy tool. He served his purpose. He got you awake. He got the merger signed, and he took the fall for the foundry explosion. My family doesn't care about Silas. We care about the land. He walked toward Clara, running a hand over her hair. She flinched away, a muffled sob escaping the tape over her mouth. "And we care about the bloodline. Your daughter is a fascinating case study in trauma. I think I can find a place for her in our foundation once you're out of the way." "You're not a doctor," I said, my hand going to my pocket, where the burner phone was linked to Garrett's laptop. "You're a parasite." "I'm a Kensington," he corrected, "and in this city, that means I'm the law." "Not today," I said. I pressed the button on the phone. Down in the basement of the tower, Garrett entered the final batch number from the Sterling ledger. Batch tam cham tam we hai bay, the foundation pour. The building didn't shake, it didn't explode, but a deep, guttural moan vibrated through the glass walls, the sound of the building's AI, realizing that its structural integrity was a lie. Suddenly, every light in the penthouse turned a violent, flashing red. Critical structural failure detected. A calm, synthetic voice echoed through the speakers. Evacuate immediately. All security grids disengaged. Elevators returning to lobby. Alistair's tablet went dark. The sleek, electronic locks on the windows and doors hissed open as the failsafes took over. "What did you do?" Alistair screamed, his composure finally shattering. "I told the truth," I said, "and the truth just condemned your building." The penthouse door burst open. Jax and two of the old guard charged in, their heavy boots thudding against the expensive white leather. Alistair reached for a hidden drawer in his desk, but Jax was faster. He tackled the doctor, sending them both crashing through a glass coffee table. I rushed to Clara. My hands were shaking as I tore the silk scarves away. The moment she was free, she threw herself into my arms, her tears hot against my neck. "Dad," she sobbed. "I thought you were dead. He told me you died in the hospital." "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." I looked up. Alistair was pinned to the floor by Jax, his prestigious face covered in blood and glass shards. He looked at me with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical heat. "You think this is over, Sterling?" he spat. "My father will bury you. He owns the judges, the mayor, the media." "He doesn't own the internet," I said, pointing to the digital screen on the wall. During the Red Tag reboot, Garrett hadn't just tripped the alarm. He had uploaded the entire Sterling ledger, the names, the batches, the bribes, and the secret recordings Jax had taken over the last 5 years, to every major news outlet in the country. On the screen, a live news bulletin was already playing. A reporter stood in front of the tower, her voice frantic. "This is a shocking development. Documents leaked moments ago prove a decades-long conspiracy by the Montgomery and Kensington families to bypass safety regulations in over 40 Chicago landmarks. The structural integrity of the very building I'm standing in is now in question." Alistair looked at the screen, and, for the first time, I saw it. The realization that the Kensington era wasn't just ending, it was being erased. What happened next changed everything, I thought, as the sound of real police sirens, not the ones on the payroll, filled the air. "Jax, get her to the stairs," I said. "I have one more thing to do. Arthur, the building is on lockdown. You have to move. I'll be right behind you." I walked over to Alistair Kensington. I didn't hit him. I didn't need to. I reached down and ripped the prestigious medical badge from his lapel. "You're not a doctor anymore," I said. "You're just a loose end." I turned to the window. In the distance, I could see the ruins of the Sterling Ironworks. The smoke was still rising. My company was gone, my house was violated, and my name was dragged through the mud. But as I looked at my daughter standing by the door, and I thought of my wife and grandson waiting in the garage, I realized I hadn't hit rock bottom. I was standing on the peak, and the reversal was complete. But as we reached the service stairs, the building gave a massive, terrifying lurch. The red tag hadn't just been a digital trick. The stress of the emergency system had put too much pressure on a compromised support beam in the basement. The tower was actually starting to tilt. The groan of the Kensington Tower wasn't a sound. It was a physical vibration that traveled through the soles of my shoes and settled in the pit of my stomach. It was the sound of 1 billion pounds of glass, ego, and compromised steel, realizing it could no longer fight gravity. Dust shaken loose from the ceiling tiles rained down like gray snow, and the red emergency lights flickered with the dying pulse of a heart that had finally given out. "Move!" Jax roared, his voice cutting through the mechanical shriek of the building. He grabbed Alistair Kensington by the collar of his expensive silk shirt now stained with blood and soot and dragged him toward the service stairs. Clara was leaning heavily on me, her legs still weak from the months of chemical sedation, but her grip on my arm was like iron. We were a broken line of survivors descending into the belly of a dying giant. The service stairwell was a vertical tunnel of panic. Every 5 stories, we could feel the tower lurch a sickening, sideways slide that sent us crashing against the concrete walls. "It's the foundation." I gasped, my lungs burning with the taste of pulverized limestone. The brittle iron in the sublevels is snapping. Once the first column goes, the rest follow like dominoes. Alistair let out a hysterical, high-pitched laugh as he stumbled down the steps. "You killed us all, Sterling. You and your father's petty little book. You didn't just expose us. You murdered every person in this building. This building was a murder weapon the day you poured the concrete. Alistair." I spat, stopping at the 11th floor landing, as another tremor shook the world. "I just took the safety off. We reached the lobby 10 minutes later, but the lobby no longer existed. The obsidian floors had buckled into jagged black mountain ranges. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows had shattered outward, coating the magnificent mile in a carpet of diamonds. Outside, the Chicago morning was a chaos of sirens and shouting. The old guard, my men, the ones who had built this city, were there, forming a human perimeter to keep the panicked crowds away from the falling debris. I saw Elena first. She was standing near the base of a bronze statue, her eyes wide with a terror that vanished the moment she saw us emerge from the dust. She ran toward us, Leo clutched in her arms. The reunion wasn't a movie moment. It was a desperate, sobbing huddle in the middle of a war zone. I took my daughter, my wife, and my grandson into my arms, and for the first time in 5 years, the darkness felt truly gone. "Is it over?" Clara whispered, looking back at the tower. "Not quite," I said. I looked at Jax, who was holding Alistair for the arriving authorities, the real ones, the federal agents Garrett had coordinated with during our flight. But as the handcuffs clicked shut on the doctor's wrists, a black limousine tore through the police tape, screeching to a halt inches from us. The back door opened, and Harrison Montgomery the elder, the patriarch, stepped out. He was 80 years old, a man who had seen the rise and fall of empires, and he looked at the tilting tower with the cold, detached eyes of a mathematician watching an equation fail. He looked at me, then at the ledger Elena still held. "You've cost me $3 billion this morning, Arthur," Montgomery said, his voice as dry as parchment. "And you've destroyed a legacy that took 3 generations to build. Your legacy was built on the graves of the men who worked for my father, Harrison," I said, stepping forward. "It was built on the lie that your money was old, but the ledger proves it was just stolen." Montgomery leaned on his cane, a faint, predatory smile touching his lips. "The ledger is a nuisance. My lawyers will tie it up in the courts for 20 years. By the time anyone goes to prison, I'll be long dead, and the Kensingtons will have rebranded. You're a ghost, Arthur. You have no company, no home, and a name that's currently associated with a terrorist attack. What do you think you've won?" I looked at the ledger. I remembered the code, the foundryman's language. I flipped to the very last page, past the batch numbers and the bribes. There, in the corner, was a small, hand-drawn map of the Sterling Heights Lodge, and a final note written in my father's shaking hand. "Arthur, the gold wasn't in the foundation. It was the foundation." I looked at Montgomery and felt a sudden, sharp clarity. "I didn't win a legal battle, Harrison. I won the truth, and my father left me one more secret you never found." I pulled the silver locket Elena had given me earlier, Grace's locket, and pressed the hidden catch on the back that I'd discovered during the helicopter ride. Inside wasn't a photo. It was a micro SD card, encased in a waterproof seal. "Grace didn't just warn me about a shirt in my dreams," I said, my voice rising over the roar of the helicopters. "She was the one who found your secret offshore accounts 5 years ago. She was the one who realized Silas was working for you. She spent the last year of her life building an encrypted vault of your financial crimes. She knew you'd kill her for it, so she hid the key in this locket and told me, in the only way she could, to wake up and find it." Montgomery's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent white. He looked at the locket as if it were a live grenade. "That card doesn't just have construction records," I continued. "It has the routing numbers for every dollar you've moved out of this country in the last decade. It has the names of the judges you bought and the senators you own. You didn't just lose a building today, Harrison. You lost the vault." The patriarch didn't speak. He simply turned and got back into his limousine. The door closed with a heavy, final thud. He knew that the reversal wasn't coming. It was already here. 6 months later, the Chicago winter had arrived, covering the city in a clean, white shroud. I stood on the porch of the Sterling Heights Lodge, the cedar logs smelling of home and wood smoke. The lodge was no longer a secret. It was the headquarters of the Sterling Foundation for Industrial Justice, an organization dedicated to protecting the rights and safety of the men and women who actually build the world. Sterling iron, steel was gone. I'd sold the remaining assets to a worker-owned cooperative, ensuring that the men of the old guard would never have to worry about a Vane or a Kensington again. The Kensington Tower had been dismantled floor by floor, its brittle iron melted down and recycled into the supports for a new, affordable housing complex on the south side. Clara was sitting in the living room, her sketches spread out across the coffee table, She was designing the new Sterling Park, a green space built on the site of the old foundry. She was healthy now, her eyes bright and clear, the pharmaceutical fog a distant memory. Elena was in the kitchen, teaching Leo how to make the sourdough bread Grace used to bake. The sound of the boys' laughter was the only music I needed. Jax and Garrett were frequent visitors. Jax had officially retired from security, spending his days restoring old motorcycles and telling Leo stories about the legend of the ironworkers. Garrett had been promoted to captain, a man who now led the Murhaith district with the same integrity his father had died for. I sat down in my father's old armchair, the leather worn and comfortable. I pulled out the ledger, now a centerpiece of the Chicago Historical Society, though they let me keep it on weekends, and looked at the final page. I'd spent 65 years thinking that my legacy was the iron I poured and the buildings I raised. I thought that to be a Sterling meant to be hard, unyielding, and cold. But as I looked at my family, I realized that the strongest thing a man can build isn't made of steel. It's made of the truth you tell, the people you protect, and the love that manages to whisper to you even from the other side of the grave. I looked at the silver locket sitting on the mantelpiece. Grace's warning had saved my life, but her love had saved my soul. What happened next didn't change the world. It didn't make the news or move the stock market. I simply walked into the kitchen, picked up my grandson, and felt the weight of a life that was finally, truly my own. The reversal was complete, not through violence or greed, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to stay broken. I had been a ghost for 5 years, but as I looked out at the falling snow, I knew I had never been more alive. I'm curious. Now that you've heard the end of my story, have you ever had a moment where your gut told you something was wrong, even when the whole world said it was right? Did you listen? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know how many of you out there have your own blue shirt stories. And if you want to hear more about how we took back the city, stay tuned. Because the Sterlings might be out of the steel business, but we're still in the business of making things right.